and welcome to the So Essential vlog. Today I'm recording a Q&A vlog. I absolutely love these because it's all about hearing from you guys, finding out what you're interested in, and we've had some really fun and interesting questions this month, so stay tuned to hear what everybody's been talking about. If you'd like to take part in the next one, simply leave your question in the comments below and we'll answer those next time. If I refer to products or tutorials, there will be links to our website below as usual, and also our blog below, so you'll be able to find any of those things that I reference. And before I get started, I always like to just quickly talk about what I'm wearing. So today this is one of my latest makes. It's a simple shift dress. It's a Burda pattern 6721. It's got these lovely 60s style darts here, but other than that, just a very simple shift dress with darts in the back as well. I made it in our Ursula fabric, which is a John Caldor, because I just fell in love with this fabric immediately as soon as I saw it. Sadly, we have sold out of this colourway now a few times, but we have got an alternative colourway on the website if you're interested, and it's just as beautiful. So yeah, you find the links to the website below as I mentioned. Other news that I wanted to talk about was that we're hosting a competition at the moment, so we really want to see what you guys have been making using our supplies. So if there's anything that you've made where you've used something that you've bought from So Essential, you can share a picture of it on Twitter, Instagram or Facebook. Just tag us in the photo and use the hashtag SoSYourMakes. It's a bit of a play on words for show us your makes, so it's SoSYourMakes. You can be entered for a chance to win £20 to spend on our website, and the closing date for that competition is the end of March. As always, if you like what you see today, please like and subscribe, and without further ado, we'll crack on with some questions. So the first question that I'm sharing today is from a lady called June Garford, who asked a really interesting question, which was, how do you manage to fit when you've got to fit yourself and you've got nobody there to help you? She just asked for any tips or tricks with that one. So the first thing that a lot of people decide to do is to buy a dressmaker's dummy. So that can be a really good starting point. We've got a really good range on our website. What we always say to people though is a dressmaker's dummy is just a starting point, and actually you might need to pad it out in certain areas so that it's a true reflection of your body, because obviously they are quite sort of stiff and they're not really truly reflective of a human form. So a lot of people might put, say, a bra on it and then pad the bra out so that it's more reflective of their shape. So that's one option that you've got. If you haven't got a dressmaker's dummy, or you don't want to buy a dressmaker's dummy, some of the other tips and advice that we would give would be use a full length mirror, clearly. Really important to see, you know, the whole garment when you're trying it on and looking in the mirror. One of the tricky things with that, obviously it's quite easy to sort of see the front and see where things are going wrong and where you need to make adjustments, but if you need to adjust the back in any way, it can be quite difficult to work out what's going on there, because if you're trying to twist round and look in the mirror over your shoulder, you're distorting your body at the back. So one way to overcome this can be to use your mobile phone to take a photo of the back of the garment in the mirror, and you can actually very cheaply now get remote controls for your phone to take photos as well. So you could even position your camera on a shelf or something, press the remote control so your arms are by your side, and then get a good shot of the back so you can clearly see what's going on there. So there's some quite handy tips. The other thing that I would say is you could try and fit one side of the garment first. So when you're standing in the mirror and you can see that, for example, you want to take one side in, or you need to take both sides in, you can work on one side first and use pins to pin it, and then take the garment off, make the same adjustment on the other side, pin it in the same place, and then try it on again, and just keep working with it like that. It is a matter of trial and error, and it is so much harder when you're doing it on your own. But some other tips that I'd give as well is when I'm doing that, for example, if I often have to take a side seam in this area here. So what I'll often do is I'll look and I can see where the side seam needs to come in, and I'll just use tailor's chalk to mark at the top where it needs to come in, and then when it needs to taper back to the original seam line, or sometimes I'll put a pin in horizontally to mark those points, you know, and they can be quite useful tips as well. So yeah, it is hard work, but definitely those things should help you, June. So I hope that helps. Do let us know if you have any further questions at all. The next question we had was from a lady called Eleanor Ritchie, who asked, what is the difference between stay tape and hemming tape? So she said she found it quite confusing what they were used for and which product was which. Now, what I actually thought, Eleanor, is that you might be confusing hemming web with stay tape, which is yet another product, just to make things even more confusing. So I thought I'd talk about all three products just to eradicate any confusion. So if I start off with hemming web, hemming web is a very sort of fine, fusible product, and it's very, very similar to a product that you've probably heard of called Bonder web. And what this is used for is for fusing fabrics together so that there's no need to stitch. So a good example of when that might be used, I can remember as a child, if say the hem came down on my school skirt or my brother's school trousers, my mum might use a bit of Bonder web to fuse the fabrics together so that she didn't have to re-stitch the hem. So that's that product. Then you've got the hemming tape, which you referred to. Now, hemming tape is a much sort of more substantial product. It's more like a cotton sort of tape. And what this is commonly used for is to hem trousers. So if you haven't got enough excess fabric on your trouser leg to create a proper hem and to fold the fabric up inside the garment, what you can do is create a false hem using this. So you would line it up with the raw edge of the fabric on the right side of the garment, and then you could stitch a very narrow seam of about 1/8 of an inch, and then turn the hemming tape into the inside of the garment, and that would give you that sort of false hem then inside the garment, rather than, because you haven't got the excess fabric on the end of the trouser leg to create it. So that's what hemming tape is used for, or one of the common uses. Stay tape is very different to hemming tape because it's a much more lightweight, fine product. It won't add any bulk at all to the fabric, and what this is used for is for stabilising fabrics and preventing stretching with fabrics. So it's very commonly used on knit fabrics, on shoulder seams or around necklines, places that have a tendency to stretch out of shape with wash and wear. You can use stay tape there. You would never use hemming tape in those places because it's much thicker, it would add loads of bulk and it would be unsightly, whereas stay tape, you just don't know it's there. It's very, very fine, very lightweight, but it will prevent any of that stretching. And it's also sometimes used say on bias cut pockets or side pockets as well for the same reason. So hopefully that answers your questions, Eleanor, yeah, on the differences between stay tape and hemming tape, and I've thrown hemming web in there as well. So next up, a lady called Anne Grodzika, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Anne, said that she wanted to know more about sewing with a twin needle, and we've had loads of questions about twin needles recently. So in light of that, I have actually written a detailed blog post. It was a couple of weeks ago now, so if you follow the link to the blog below, you'll be able to find it, where we talked about the different types of twin needle that you might come across. We talked about how to thread a machine for twin needling, how to sew with a twin needle, and then also troubleshooting for a twin needle. So I'll talk you through a bit, you know, give you a brief overview of what was covered, but if you want all of the detail, it's probably best to go to the blog post where there's detailed photographs as well. But one particular question that Anne focused in on was, she said that she'd noticed, she's been using a twin needle, thought she was getting on fine, but she's noticed recently that one of the seams has popped. So she asked for advice on how you could avoid that happening. And the suggestion that we came up with that you can try, which does work in our experience is to sew with a very, very small zigzag stitch when you're using the twin needle, so just a 0.5mm zigzag, so it's hardly noticeable. It'll pretty much look like a straight stitch, but that can work just to give you that bit more stretch within the stitch, so that's worth a try. Clearly you need to think about which twin needle you're using and the gap between the two needles, and also the gap in your zigzag presser foot and throat plate, because you know it needs to be able to fit within those gaps. So what we recommend, as always, is just test it on a scrap of fabric and actually turn the hand wheel manually just to make sure it will fit within those gaps, and you might need to then try a twin needle with a smaller gap between the needles if it doesn't. So that's one way to tackle that problem and try and overcome that problem. But as I said, I'd give a quick overview. So the types of twin needle you can come across, they have different gaps in terms of the gap between the two needles, as I mentioned in answer to Anne's question. So ours come in anything from a 1.6mm gap right up to a 6mm gap, so there's a big amount of variety there to choose from, and it depends on the task at hand. The other thing is that twin needles come with different sized eyes as well, so you've got your 75s, your 80s, your 90s, and that basically it tells you how big the eye of the needles are. So if you're working with a thicker thread, you need a bigger eye, and if you're working with a finer thread, you can use a smaller eye. But they also come, as well as all other needles do, with specialist needles for different kinds of fabric. So here I've got a twin needle for embroidery, I've got a twin needle for ballpoint fabric, a ballpoint twin needle for stretch fabrics, and also a stretch needle for stretch fabrics as well. And we go into detail in the blog post about which ones are for which, but it's just worth bearing that in mind. You can get twin needles for jeans as well, you know, for using metallic threads as well. So there's quite a lot of choice there, but as I mentioned, it is all detailed in the blog post. In terms of sewing with a twin needle and setting your machine up, I think this is probably one of the things that puts people off the most, but it's actually dead simple. All you need to do is thread your machine in the normal way with one needle, so thread it exactly as you normally would. But then with the second, for the second needle, you just need to use your second spool pin if you have one, which is usually on top of the machine. If you don't have one, you can use the bobbin pin. Some people do that, or that you can buy a separate sort of accessory stand that you can use. But whatever you're using, put your second reel of thread on that, thread your machine in the normal way again, apart from when you get to the needle bar, there is a final thread guide at the top of the needle bar, and whereas you will have threaded your first needle in the normal way and passed that thread behind that thread guide on the needle bar, the second thread, it's recommended that you don't pass that behind the needle bar thread guide, that you leave that in front, and that's just to prevent tangling really and the threads twisting, because you want those threads to remain separate obviously. In terms of sewing with it, usually lengthening your stitch length will really help you to get better results, and it is, as always, just a matter of trial and error. You know, test on scraps of fabric until you're happy with the results. You can adjust the needle tension as well. That's one of the things we recommend, and that can give you different results, so that's worth a try. Some people will advise you to adjust the tension in your bobbin case, but we're always a bit nervous about doing that, to be honest, because sometimes you can never quite get it back to the original setting. But if you want to have a play around with that, what we would recommend is get a spare bobbin case and play around with that and keep one of them set to the original tension, so that you can always get back to that original tension. You're not going to have a problem with that. One of the other things we talked about with regards to troubleshooting is you might come up against problems with tunnelling. So this is again to do with tension. Because of the tension of the stitches, it can create like a tunnel in between the lines of stitching where the fabric protrudes or stands up, I suppose. And yeah, altering your needle tension, it will kind of help you with that. But another really good tip that I always use when I'm using a twin needle is to use a bit of tear away or wash away stabilizer. So you just slip that underneath the fabric and stitch in the normal way from the right side of the fabric, and that just gives the fabric a bit more stability, and it just prevents that tunnelling from being as exaggerated. So that's a good little tip as well. And yeah, other than that, I suppose sewing with a twin needle as well, the other thing to say is you press your hem under in the normal way and then you stitch from the right side of the fabric. But as I say, all the details are in the blog post. Do let us know if there's anything else you'd like me to talk through. But yeah, hopefully that helps, and I hope you get on okay with that, and the slight zigzag works for you. Next up, a lady called Cheryl Anderson asked where I got my lovely pegboard from, which is behind me. So in answer to your question, Cheryl, I looked at the ready-made pegboards that are out there, and I thought they were really expensive for what they were. So what I did was I went to a local timber merchants or hardware type place, and they actually sold just the pieces of pegboard. So it's like an MDF type board with all the holes pre-drilled in it. So I went and bought some of that, and then I bought some wooden frame from the same place, just a narrow sort of wooden frame. And then I painted the pegboard the colour that I wanted it, and then I commandeered my husband into framing it for me, which he did, and then we were able to just mount it using the frame onto the wall, and it cost like an absolute fraction of the cost of buying a pegboard that size ready-made. So yeah, I was quite lucky that I could kind of rope my husband into putting the frame on for me, because I'm not great with woodwork myself. But yeah, it was a DIY job, so definitely recommend giving that a try. The next question was from a lady called Hayley Graham, and this was a really fun question. She said, if somebody stole all of your sewing machines and left you with $250, which sewing machine would you buy? So thanks for that, Hayley, because yeah, it definitely got me thinking. So the first thing I had to do was work out how much is $250, and it turns out it's about £180 for anyone in the UK. So I had a quick look around at what was available in that price bracket, and one of the machines we sell on our website, the Janome J318, was the machine I chose in that price bracket, just because it's got all the features you need to get started and get cracking with your sewing projects again. But it also comes, you can also buy additional accessories and feet as well, so it would kind of grow with you, you know, as you started working on different types of projects, you'd be able to get the accessories and the feet to work on those. But also it's just got a couple of nice features as well that you don't often get with those sort of entry-level machines. So it's got a drop feed which allows you to do freehand embroidery, which is quite a nice feature, and it's also got the option for circular sewing as well. It's got a convertible arm which allows you to do circular sewing. So yeah, it's just a great machine really for that price. There's some really nice features on there, and the potential to sort of for the machine to grow with you, I suppose, with the additional accessories. The next question was also from Hayley. So Hayley asked how you would finish a neckline in a woven fabric. So the two most common options you've got to do this are either to use bias binding or to use a facing. So bias binding, you can buy ready-made. So here's an example. This is a roll of bias binding, and it comes in all different sizes, but normally for a neckline you probably use something fairly narrow, such as this one, or you can create your own as well, and there's an in-depth blog post on our blog about how to do that and how to attach it to the garment. But essentially you'd line the raw edge of the binding up with the raw edge of the garment on the right sides together, and stitch that down, usually with a fairly narrow seam. And then you've got the option to turn the binding fully inside the garment, which almost is acting like a facing, I suppose, and then top stitching that down from the right side, or potentially you could fold under the edge of the binding that's going to sit inside the garment, and then hand stitch that in place. Or the other option you've got is you could have the binding slightly visible around the neckline, which you'll commonly see as well. And in that case, you would stitch it to the right side of you'd stitch right sides together along the edge of the neckline again, and then you'd turn it to the inside, but you'd have some of the binding visible along the edge of the neckline. And again, you've got the options of either hand stitching it in place from the inside, or you might want to stitch in the ditch where your binding and your top join. So there's a few different options there. And then the other option you've got is a facing. So often sewing patterns will come with facings actually designed to finish the neckline. So one example is this Tilly and the Buttons Orla blouse I've got here, and you can see this is a facing here that sort of sits inside the garment, and it's designed specifically to finish the neckline. So if you haven't got one with your pattern, you can draw one yourself by using the neckline on the pattern piece and drawing one yourself. But ultimately a facing, you put right sides together, stitch with the relevant seam allowance, and then turn the facing to the inside. And normally you just finish the raw edge of the facing with an overlocking stitch or an overcasting stitch, and that then just sits inside the garment. But what's important with facings is to remember to do what's called understitching, and again there's another tutorial for that on our blog. But understitching the facing means that you sew the seam allowances to the facing so that the facing sits neatly inside, and it doesn't want to keep rolling up and coming to the above the seam line. And often you need to just stitch the facings in place as well at the shoulder seams as well. So they're the two most common options, Hayley, for finishing a woven neckline, so I hope that's helpful to you. The next question was from a lady called Kathleen Meadows, who said she noticed that we've got a gorgeous range of high quality fabrics, and do we ship to Canada? And this one's really easy to answer, Kathleen, because yes, we do. I'm really happy to say we do. And there is on our website a list of all the countries that we ship to if anybody's interested. So yeah, happy days. And the final question was from a lady called Lynn Martin, who asked for a bit of advice about pattern matching. Lynn asked, when do you do it? When is it absolutely imperative? Are there areas that are more important than others? So she just generally wanted some advice around pattern matching. So again, it's a sort of general area, and it's sort of down to individual taste, but here's my advice and the advice of the team at Sew Essential. So the first thing to think about is the pattern of your fabric. So if the print is really, really busy, you know, you're probably not going to want to try and pattern match that, because you're just going to end up causing yourself a huge amount of heartache and difficulty, really. But if it's a pattern that's very, very obvious and you think it'll look really bad if it's not pattern matched, then that's one to consider working on. The next thing to consider is the pattern that you're using as well, because if it is something that you need to pattern match, so for example, I pattern matched a tartan shift dress because I thought, you know, it's going to look awful if the lines for the tartan checks are out of sync. So if it is one that you think, yes, I definitely need to pattern match that, think about the pattern that you're actually using, because if it's something with princess seams or yokes or lots of different visible seam lines on the garment, it's going to make your life quite difficult, and you're going to have to pick and choose which ones you try to pattern match. So it's definitely worth thinking about that. And if you do want to pattern match, it's easier if you choose a pattern with very simple lines. So when I pattern matched the tartan, I did a very simple, it was like a 60s sleeveless pinafore shift dress type thing. Then it's about sort of prioritising where the pattern matching happens, I guess. So for me, the most obvious places are the side seams, the centre back, or if you have a centre front seam, it's those places where it's going to be immediately obvious, and where actually it is relatively easy to pattern match as well, that you need to be thinking about. And a really good tip when working in these areas is to pattern match from the hem up. Now this is a mistake I made with the shift dress initially, because I pattern matched it beautifully when I was cutting it out down the side seams, but then once I sewed the darts, clearly that shifts everything up on the front piece when I sewed the bust darts, and then it was all out of sync. And what Angela advised me, who's my mother-in-law and co-owner of Sew Essential, she advised me that you should always pattern match from the hem up, because if things do go awry because of your bust darts or whatever towards the top end of the side seam, that's going to be under your arm anyway, so it's not going to be as visible. So that's, you know, some useful considerations there. Clearly you could pin your bust darts first on the pattern paper if you wanted to take that into account with the pattern matching. You could pin the bust darts into place so you get the length that the pattern piece will be when it's actually sewn together. That's another consideration. And another place that could be really obvious, if you've got sewn on pockets, that can be, you know, on shirts and things, men's shirts for example, where you get pockets here, or skirts where you might have sewn on pockets on the front. That would be very obvious as well. If you want to pattern match, there are other places to consider doing so. And then in terms of just general tips when you're cutting your fabric out, because that's the place where you can kind of take the time and really put some thought into it, and if you can get that right, then your pattern matching will be a lot easier. So one tip is that you could cut on the single layer rather than folding your fabric and cutting on a double layer, because it can be very difficult to make sure that your fabric is absolutely perfectly 100% on top of each other in terms of the print on the fabric. So that's a good piece of advice, is to perhaps consider working on a single layer of fabric when you're cutting out. Also, just look for a really obvious point in the print and line, you know, your corner of your pattern piece up with that, so you've got like a really easy to spot marker on the fabric. And then the other thing to consider as well is, don't forget about your seam allowances. So if you're lining the edge of the pattern piece up with a really obvious marker on your fabric, just think about the fact that actually where the seam line will be 5/8 or whatever the seam allowance is away from there. So you need to take that into consideration and look at what part of the print is there when you lay the corresponding piece on the fabric as well. So yeah, it's definitely, you know, something that is tricky and it can be a bit of a mind bender from my experience. But you know, I've done it on a few different projects now, and I think it's just another one of those things that it's giving yourself the benefit of time, not rushing it, taking the time to think really carefully about it. You know, if you're not 100% sure, don't cut the fabric until you're 100% sure. And you know, if you're working with a tissue paper pattern, you can see through that tissue most of the time. You'll be able to see the print and see where the seam line will lie, just to give you that confidence that you've got it in exactly the right place. So I hope all of that helps. I've really enjoyed answering all of these questions today, and thank you so much for sending them in. We really love to hear from you. Please keep the questions coming, because we will respond to them again in the next Q&A vlog in a few weeks' time. That's all from me today. If you like what you've seen, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.